thank you for all you're doing. I think that you've hit a patriotic core for a lot of people, for everything that you stand for. I wanted to ask, the first question I wanted to ask is, in your book, American Values, which I read, it helped me understand what the Democrats stood for, back in the day. You articulate that very well. And of course, it feels like there's a realignment today. Can you explain what's going on with that party?
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, thanks for having me, Ken and Robert. I'm really happy to be here with you. And thank you all for that wonderful welcome when I came out. I would say if you went down the list of policy priorities and values that my father had, that my uncle had, and I would check off every box. And the Democratic Party today, I don't think stands for those things. I would say that the primary issues were that the Democratic Party was very concerned with protecting our Constitution, and particularly freedom of speech. And the word liberal is derived from freedom of speech. And that was this core belief that the Democratic Party, that democracy was, the foundation stone for democracy was the free flow of information, and that the best policies would be annealed in the furnace of debate, and then they would rise in the marketplace of ideas. And that was the advantage that democratic systems had over totalitarian systems. Totalitarian systems are much more efficient than democracy. You have one guy at the top who can quickly make decisions, would move very quickly, and that's an advantage for a nation and a society. But it was thought that the advantage for democracy was this clash, this dialectic of ideas, which would give us an advantage in the marketplace. The Democratic Party that I grew up with was anti-war. My uncle, President Kennedy, was asked by his best friend Ben Bradley, who was then the editor of the Washington Post, "What do you want on your gravestone?" And my uncle said, without skipping a beat, he kept the peace. He said the primary job of a president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. He said that he didn't want children in Africa and Asia and Latin America, when they heard about the United States of America, to be thinking of a man in a military uniform with a gun. He wanted them to be thinking of a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted them to be thinking of the USAID program, the Kennedy Milk Program, which gave milk to millions of malnourished kids around the world, the Alliance for Progress. These programs that he created to give the USAID directly to the poor, to grow democratic institutions, to grow the middle class in those countries, and to end run the oligarchies and the military juntas that had once been the target of USAID. He wanted, the resistance of the emergence of corporate control of our regulatory agencies was something that was a foundation stone of the bedrock of the Democratic Party. Today's Democratic Party is pro-censorship. And censorship is now metastasizing around the globe. We saw Brazil yesterday ban Twitter. We saw the head of Telegram being torn off an airplane and locked in jail in France. We saw 2 weeks ago the head of the European Commission threaten Elon Musk with prosecution if he interviewed Donald Trump on Twitter, which is insane. He's the former president of the United States. He's the nominee of one of the two great political parties. And his ideas are too dangerous for the people of Europe to hear, or for expatriates, American expatriates. We're seeing this spread across the globe, and the Democratic Party today has endorsed that censorship. It's become the Democratic Party I grew up with represented the poor and the middle class in our country, working people, cops, firefighters, union people. And today it's the party of Wall Street, of big ag, big tech, big data, big pharma. And if you look at, at the last election, roughly 50% of the people in the United States voted for Donald Trump and 50% voted for Joe Biden. But the 50% who voted for Joe Biden controls 70% of the wealth in our country. The 50% who voted for Donald Trump control 30%. So that's a complete inversion. The Democratic Party has now become the party of the elite, the party of the wealthy. And then, one last thing, although there are many, many others I could talk about. The Democratic Party that I grew up with was a party that was fighting to make sure every American could get the right to vote for the person that they chose to vote for. And this Democratic Party has used lawfare, has used the courts to keep me off the ballot, to keep Donald Trump off the ballot. And it's exactly the opposite of what, a couple of months ago, President Biden and President Harris talked about, they were ridiculing Vladimir Putin, who had just won the Russian election with 88% of the vote. And they said the only way he could do that is he controls the media, and he didn't let any of his opponents on the ballot. Well, they did the same thing. So,
Isn't that called gaslighting or something like that, where you?
yeah, gaslighting is a word that's gotten a lot of traction.
Yeah.
I think since COVID, it's become it's really come into the vernacular, and it's, it's a very, very useful word and very apropos now in so many circumstances. But I'll say one thing about that last statement I made. When Ross Perot ran for president in 1992, he was, for 10 months he was running, and he had 34 major media interviews during that period. On ABC, in CNN, those of you who remember his run, he was on Larry King almost, it seemed like he was on every week. In 17 months, I only got 2 live interviews on ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC. I was completely blocked out, and then the networks collaborated with the 2 candidates, but mainly with the DNC, to keep me off the debating stage. So the American people really never got a chance to hear me. And that's one of the reasons that it became clear to me that I did not have a reasonable path to victory in this campaign.
Well, for me, I'm old enough to remember your family, because I was in high school when your uncle was taken out, and then your father. So your family and your family mesmerized the world. My father, poor dad, was so inspired by John Kennedy. They resigned from their positions and they joined the Peace Corps. So that's how much the spirit of your family was spreading throughout the world. And I just want to commend you, because I shamelessly brought your book here. I wanted to sign it. So generally, I'm the person that's being asked for the autograph. I'm going to go, oh, please sign my book. Yeah. But anyway, the book Profiles in Courage, I just want to commend you, because you represent courage. And that's why I think people respect you more and more. And I give you credit. I saw some of the comments your family had about you. It takes courage to go against your family. So I commend you for that.
My uncle and my father really saw America as a template for democracy. And we were an exemplary nation not because we were forcing people democracy of the barrel of a gun, or rather, because we were modeling its virtues. In 1789, when we first, or 1792, when we first adopted the Bill of Rights, there was only one democracy on earth, and that was us. By 1865, the end of the Civil War, there were 5, all modeled on America. By the time my uncle took office, there were 130, and by the end of the 1960s, there were 190. And all of them were ultimately modeled on America. So the experiment with self-government that we had in this country was very successful as a template, as a role model for the rest of the world. My uncle recognized that, and he also recognized how fruitless war was as a foreign policy. He had fought in the war. His brother, 2 of my uncles were killed in the war. He was lost was MIA, presumed dead, for 10 days when the Japanese destroyer cut his PT boat in 2. He had fought in war, and he was skeptical of the generals, of the military brass, and of the drive for war. And 3 days before his inauguration, Eisenhower, his predecessor, gave this speech that today stands as one of the most important speeches in American history, where he warned Americans against the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would destroy democracy. My uncle spent 1,000 days in his administration actively battling his military apparatus and his intelligence agencies to keep the country out of war. And he never sent a combat troop abroad to die. His military staff begged him to send 250,000 people to Vietnam. They said, military personnel, they said the government was going to collapse. He refused. He ended up sending 16,000 military advisors. And then on October 27, who weren't allowed to participate in combat, but some of them did. On October 22nd, 1963, he heard that a Green Beret had died in Vietnam, and he asked his aide, Walt Rostow, for a casualty list. Walt Rostow came back and said there were 75 Americans that died then. And my uncle said, that's too many. We're bringing them all home. And that afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all military personnel home from Vietnam. And 30 days after that, he was killed. And a week after that, LBJ, his successor, remanded that order and then sent 250,000 troops in, and Nixon came in and sent 560,000. 56,000 Americans never came home, including my cousin, George Skakel, who died in the Tet Offensive. And then my father ran 5 years later against the Vietnam War and was killed after winning the primary, the California primary. But, when I was a little kid, the whole world remembered America for that. Today, there are more statues to John Kennedy, more boulevards and avenues named after him, more parks and public buildings and hospitals and schools named for him than any other president, and probably more than all the presidents combined. And it was because he understood the uses of power, and he understood that military power was not a way to make America stronger or to make it more effective leader in the world. And I'll just tell you, can I tell you one little story? When I was in 1964, so a year after my uncle died, I went to Poland with my dad and with 3 of my siblings and my mother, and it was a communist government at that point in Poland. And they did not want us there. They told my father not to come. He came anyway at the invitation of a democracy group. But they didn't want the Polish people to know we were there, and they blacked out any coverage of our presence in the country. And we, in fact, before we went, 2 days before we went, my mother brought us shopping in Washington, D.C. To buy toys and clothing for kids in an orphanage in Warsaw. That we were a very large orphanage we were going to go visit. But when we got to the orphanage, we were very excited to hand out these presents. The government had removed all the children to make sure there was no contact. 2 days later, we were in Krakow, And we went to see the Cardinal of Krakow, who was a living saint. He had stood up to communists. He'd been tortured. He'd been jailed. He had endured these ordeals with such forbearance and piety that he inspired a religious resurgence in the Catholic Church in Poland. And everybody knew that when he died, he was going to be beatified by the church. And for me, for us little Catholic kids who read the lives of the saints every day, this was the most exciting thing, to meet a real saint. We went in and met him. We spent about 3 hours in the cathedral, and then we came back out. When we went in, you came in through Krakow Square. There was nobody in the square. The only car in the square was the black embassy limousine. When we came out, there were 1 million people waiting for us. And they had emptied out, the word of our presence had passed by word of mouth. They had emptied out every store, they shut the shops, and the entire city had showed up to see an American leader. And our limo was stuck in the sea of people, humanity. We couldn't move. My father dragged us all up on the roof. And I sat up there, a 10-year-old kid signing autographs. And my father made a speech, and then they started singing to us. They sang a song called Sto Lat, which means may you live forever. And then they began singing the old Polish national anthem, which was an anti-communist song. And the ambassador told us it was a criminal offense. You would go to jail for singing that song, and they sang it again and again and again. And I was up there, with people reaching to touch my father, and tears coming down people's faces of joy at seeing American leadership. And on that trip, we went to France, Germany, Greece, Italy, and Britain, and the same thing happened everywhere.
Yeah.
Our country was beloved.
Yeah.
All over the world. And today, nobody would care if an American leader, they're more likely to get, things thrown at them.
Yeah.
And that was a good foreign policy because, that kind of moral authority was good for our security, it was good for our economy, and it was just morally good for our nation. And, we need to start thinking about ways to get that back.
Right. Well, that's why thank you. It's like I said, I'm old enough to remember they called it Camelot had come to the world. John Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, and all this. And your uncle said, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. But again, action speaks louder than words. And so your uncle started the Peace Corps. And so we went into action. It wasn't just words there. And then today, what we have is what Trump calls the swamp. And I think you know who the swamp is more than any of us in this room here. And so I want to ask you, what do you know of the swamp? And what do you think of Fauci?
I think the swamp is kind of an amorphous term, but it's very accurate. It really, to me, means the domination of democracy by corporate power, by the power of, and that, all of our regulatory agencies have now become captured by the industries they're supposed to regulate. The FDA, the CDC, and the NIH have been captured by the pharmaceutical industry, and their function is not to make Americans healthy. In fact, for them, the most profitable entity on earth is a sick child. And they make, the sicker our people are, the more money they make. And they're pushing the mercantile interest of the pharmaceutical industry rather than promoting public health. EPA is run by the pesticide industry, by the chemical industry. USDA is run by big agricultural conglomerates like Cargill and Monsanto. I've sued all these agencies. The FCC is run by the telecom companies, and they become sock puppets for the industry they're supposed to regulate. And most nefarious of it all, the intelligence agencies are serving the interests of the military-industrial complex. The big companies, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and their function is to provide that industry with a constant pipeline of new wars so they can sell their products. Right. And it's ubiquitous. It's happened throughout all of our agencies, and the intelligence agencies in recent years have become more powerful vis-a-vis our democracy than at any time in our history. And they now have the power of these new technologies like AI, which are very, very frightening. They legally now can do surveillance on the American people, which was never true before. They're running many of our most important publications, so they already have the capacity to sort of dictate public perception. But with the advent of AI, they're going to literally be able to twist reality. And their capacity to surveil and control us is really a frightening prospect. And that's why it's so critical now that we should be raising the bulwarks of our constitutional rights and not being part of this erosion of our constitutional rights, and particularly that the first and most important right is freedom of speech. A government that has the capacity to a government that has the capacity to silence its critics has a license for any atrocity. And we're in a very frightening time now where we are seeing the normalization of censorship. I saw this quote that Vice President Harris, vice presidential partner, Governor Walz, said last year, where he said that the First Amendment is not absolute, that it does not protect misinformation or disinformation. And he is legally wrong there. It does protect that. The First Amendment protects speech, true speech, and it protects lies.
Right.
It protects good speech and it protects bad speech.
Right.
It protects all speech. And, they didn't pass the First Amendment to protect speech that everybody likes. They passed it to protect the speech that's inconvenient, that's abhorrent, that nobody wants to hear, that's dangerous. That is the price of democracy. And the fact that we now have political leaders who do not understand this. I mean, I remember in 1976, when the entire liberal establishment supported the ACLU in defending the right of Nazis to march through a neighborhood in Skokie, Illinois that was largely populated by Holocaust survivors. Correct. And everybody was appalled by what their message was. We also understood we had to be we had to be willing to die for their right to say things that were abhorrent. And if we don't have that, democracy is gone. We're going to lose it.
Correct.
The idea that you have a vice president, a guy who wants to be vice president of this country, who does not know that, who does not know the First Amendment is not limited, that it is essentially, there's speech that is not protected. Pedophilia is not protected. You can prosecute it. Urging violent action is not protected. Shouting fire in a crowded theater is not protected. But Judge Louis Brandeis said that otherwise speech is protected. And Louis Brandeis said that the remedy for bad speech, the remedy for lies, is not censorship, it's more speech. It is the marketplace. Yes. And that, if we don't understand that, we will lose democracy for sure.
So, So,
wait. What about Fauci? I want to know. Everybody.
I mean, I wrote a book about Fauci. And,
Great
there's 2,200 footnotes in the book, and I invited people at the beginning of the book. All of my sources in the books are. I did something that had never been done before, which I put them on a barcode next to them, so you can actually, as you read, you can look up the sourcing. And I invited people to find problems with the book. I said, tell me what they are, and we will correct them. We had 27 editions, so we had the capacity to correct anything, and nobody ever told us any actual error in that book. And if you read that book, it's hard to, I don't look into Anthony Fauci's head. I don't look into Bill Gates' head. I don't say he did this because he was greedy or because he was manipulative. I just lay out what they did, and the story speaks for itself. And, it's a story of people involved in really terrible, terrible, immoral, homicidal, criminal behavior. And using a position in government that he had for 50 years without any election to clamp down these totalitarian controls that were not science-based and that everybody now admits there was no science. In fact, yesterday, the chief attorney for FDA admitted that there was no reason. He admitted because he lost the case in court against a doctor, but there was no reason to discourage people from taking ivermectin. Ivermectin was a very, very devastating cure for COVID. It literally obliterated COVID. And by depriving people of ivermectin, many people, millions of people around the globe died. And they didn't need to. There were cures for COVID from day one, and very effective cures. Right. But they didn't want that. They wanted the vaccine only. And there's a rule, a little-known federal rule that they were all aware of, which said that you cannot issue an emergency use authorization for a vaccine if there is an existing remedy that has already been approved for any use. So if they admitted that hydroxychloroquine or famotidine or ivermectin or any of the 25 existing therapeutic drugs that were very effective against COVID, if they admitted that any of them were effective, the whole vaccine project would have fallen apart. They couldn't have done it. And so they decided that they were going to pretend that there was no cure except for the vaccine. And they gave people a product that was not properly tested, and then now you have a whole generation of kids that has now, got myocarditis, these terrible heart problems in young athletic boys. You're seeing so many kids now drop dead on playing fields, right. And that we never saw anything like this before. On average, it was, I think, 29 a month globally, athletes who died on the field. And we were getting down to hundreds a month now. Right. And it's, and there still has to be a reckoning. The mainstream media hasn't caught up with the science. But the science is out there now, and it's devastating.
What's going to happen with all the deaths and all that?
With what?
Are there going to be lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit because of the young people dying?
You can't sue them because they passed an act. No, you can't. We passed a law in this country called VICA in 1986 that made it illegal to sue a vaccine company, no matter how reckless they are, no matter how negligent they are, no matter how grievous your injury, you cannot sue them. And so, and that's why there was this right. When I was a kid, I only had 3 vaccines. I was compliant. My kids had to get 72 vaccines. Oh. Today's children have to get 79 vaccines, and none of them have been safety tested, not one of them. And in fact, I said that for many years. vaccines are exempt from pre-licensing safety testing. And I said that again and again, and Anthony Fauci would say publicly, oh, he's lying about that. So in 2016 or 2017, President Trump appointed me to run a vaccine safety commission, and we had a few meetings, and he made Fauci meet with me and Collins and some of the other people. And I said to him, Tony, you've been saying for years that there's a safety study on these vaccines. Can you show me one? And he made a show of going through this file drawer that they had brought with them. And he said, oh, I left them back in my office in Bethesda. And I said, can you send them to me? He said, yeah, and of course he never did. So then we sued him, me and Aaron Siri, and they stonewalled us for a year, and then on the courthouse steps, HHS gave us a letter saying, yeah, there's never been a safety study of any vaccine that's on the childhood schedule pre-licensing. And so nobody knows what the risk profile is for any of these products. And, we've seen an explosion of chronic disease, and as coterminous, as soon as the industry said, here's a product that you don't have to safety test, that saves $500 million. There is no downstream liability, which is the biggest cost for every medical product, because every medical product causes injury to some group. It may be rare, but somebody gets hurt. And there's no marketing or advertising cost because the federal government is going to order 76 billion kids to take this product. If you can get that product on the schedule, on the CDC recommended schedule, it's typically worth $1 billion a year profit to your company. So there was a gold rush, and we went from a couple of 3 vaccines to 72 vaccines in a couple of years, and that 1989 was the big change year. And that's the year we started seeing this explosion of autoimmune diseases, of allergic diseases. Peanut allergies suddenly appeared, food allergies, and all of these, and then these neurological diseases, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism. Autism went from 1 in 10,000 in my generation to 1 in every 34 kids today, according to CDC. In California, 1 in every 22 kids has autism. And diabetes and all of these are listed as side effects on the manufacturer's inserts of these products. Diabetes went from being, when I was a kid, the typical pediatrician would see 1 case of diabetes in his lifetime. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. And it is now, when my uncle was president, we spent zero nationally on chronic disease, not $1 a year. Today it's $4.3 trillion. And it's not, I'm not saying, and I have never said this, all coming from the vaccines, but it's the food, it's the pharmaceuticals. Our kids are swimming around in a toxic soup now, and we need to identify exactly what's causing these problems, and we need to eliminate them. And we have this.
Well, we're certainly going to help you make America healthy again if we can.
Thank you.
I wanted to, 10 years ago, Robert and I were in Russia interviewing a young man at the time that started VK, Pavel Durov.
Who just got arrested.
Pavel Durov.
Yeah, we interviewed him 10 years ago.
Oh.
And it's interesting because in that interview, and the reason I'm bringing this up is he was leaving the country and they took his company from him, which was the Facebook of Russia.
They took his what?
His company.
Yeah.
He left.
Russia.
Yeah. And then he started Telegram, which is private. And then he was flying around. Tucker Carlson's interview was fantastic with him. And at the time, though, he's like, our privacy is under attack. And I don't think I mean, I think we've kind of taken that for granted, and it seems to me like, that Zuckerberg could have done what Pavel did, but he didn't, And he said what they're trying to do is they're trying to come in on a back door through Telegram. And he said no, and then of course, just this last week he got arrested. So it's clear that everybody wants our data. They want to know what we're doing, and then they want to use that to manipulate what they want. What's the best way to fix this?
Okay, let me say a couple of things and talk about how to fix it. One is that last week, another development, which is Mark Zuckerberg came out and admitted that he had been pressured by the White House and had complied in censoring President Biden's political opponents. I already knew this. The press still says, "Oh, this didn't happen," but now, it's kind of now there's going to be a day of reckoning. And I already won a case, and my injunction was reinstated last week by the federal judge. It's called Biden versus Kennedy, or Kennedy versus Biden. And Judge Doty did this decision. He wrote a 155-page decision detailing how the censorship took place. And 37 hours after he took the oath of office, President Biden, White House opened a portal to all of the social media sites and ordered Mark Zuckerberg to begin censoring me. And Zuckerberg took down my Instagram account, which had 1 million followers, almost 1 million followers. And this portal now was controlled by the FBI. So he put the FBI in charge of censoring Americans. But the FBI then opened the portal to other agencies, including the CIA, NIH, the IRS, I don't know what they were censoring, DHS, and CISA, which is this new agency that is the center of the censorship industrial complex in this country. And so I now have an injunction against the White House from further ordering what they were ordering Zuckerberg and Twitter. Elon wasn't there yet. And the other companies to censor my speech, and not just medical issues, but also, and by the way, they were unable to point to a single factual error in anything I post. We're very, very careful. I have a huge fact-checking. We have 350 PhD scientists, MD physicians who were looking at what I wrote to make sure that everything was sourced and cited. He couldn't point to a single piece of misinformation. In fact, Zuckerberg, his people pushed back on the White House and said, this is actually factually accurate. And they had to introduce a new word, which was called malinformation, which is information that is factually accurate, but nevertheless inconvenient to the government. And it was misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And so Facebook continues to censor me, and as does YouTube and Google. And they say, well, we're not doing it with White House approval. We're just doing it because we think it's a public service. And they censor stuff that I say about the war in Ukraine, about a lot of different issues that have nothing to do with countermeasures, medical countermeasures. With Pavel Durov, it's very interesting to watch what happened to him, because why did they arrest him? Yeah. He's arrested, first of all, in France. And of all the countries in Europe, France has robust tradition of freedom of speech, as we have. During the French Revolution, 1789, they passed all these laws just fortifying freedom of speech. And then in the 1880s, they passed another raft of law. And the French are as proud of their tradition of freedom of speech as we are. And so it's funny that they arrested him in France. He touched down. He's a citizen of Abu Dhabi. And he's been thrown out of Russia. And he touched down in France to get gas, or fuel for his plane. And what seems clear is that the United States must have pressured Macron to make the arrest. Because, they come in and tear him off his airplane, and then they put him in jail. Why would they do this? The Europeans are already censoring content. So anything they didn't like, they can remove. They don't have to arrest him. Not only that, but Abu Dhabi has an extradition treaty with France. Why didn't they just, if they thought he did something wrong, why didn't they just go through the process instead of embarrassing Abu Dhabi and doing this, this dramatic event? And I think probably it's likely that they're censoring him not because of what he's doing here, but because of what's happening in Russia. Telegram is heavily utilized in Russia, and it's utilized by people who are opposed to the Ukraine war. And it's also used in Ukraine by both sides. And I think it's one of the major reasons that ways that people who are opposed to that war are talking to each other. And I suspect that was something that the CIA found intolerable. And that NATO, is basically now a CIA subsidiary. And that's probably what's behind it, although nobody can tell, nobody knows. But it's very strange that they did that.
So getting back more to the home front, there's two questions. Let's say you're president. How would you go after NIH, CDC, and all that? What would you do as president? And number two,
what would I?
If you were president right now, what would you do to tone down the CDC?
Okay.
But the second most important question for everybody here is you had a child today. It's exactly as you say. They're a lot of money. I mean, they're a place to put drugs into. How does a parent fight back? Like if you fight from Washington, how does a parent fight back at home against the vaccines? Or how can they stop this?
I mean, the thing is, if you're a parent today, part of the responsibility of being a parent is, unfortunately, is to not trust everything your doctor says and to understand that the medical that doctors have been co-opted by the medical cartel, that the medical schools are now run by pharmaceutical companies, they're funded by them, and that the doctors believe mainly what they're doing. They're also heavily compensated. A typical pediatrician's office makes about 50% of its funding comes from vaccines, not actually from selling the individual vaccines, from the traffic. I mean, when I was a kid, I went to the doctor when I needed stitches, and that's it. And today, every kid goes to the doctor at least 10 times to get their vaccines, and that foot traffic in and out of the office is a major part of the business plan for the pediatrician office. And they're also then rewarded by Blue Cross Blue Shield, which has a reward schedule for pediatricians who vaccinate 80 or 85% of the kids in their office. Get these giant bonuses, I think $40 or $400 per kid, huge amounts of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars that they make, making sure that 85% of the kids are vaccinated. And that's why they throw you out of the office if you fight back. It's not because they care so much about your particular kid. It's that you'll throw off the metrics and you'll lose them their bonuses. And so and those schedules have now been published, so people can actually go look at the Blue Cross Blue Shield schedule, and you can see what your pediatrician is making, and it's huge amounts of money from complying. And so, they have these perverse incentives that make it so that they're not really treating your kid as an individual patient. And so your job in a democracy, in today's democracy, is to do your own research. And that's hard to do, but you need to do it to protect your child. And parents go out of their way to make sure that their kids are eating the right food, that they're not getting toxic, they're getting organic vegetables, organic meats, etc. You need to do the same thing with your medicines. The medicines, there's a huge profit incentive for people to overlook problems with them. And so that is the advice that I would give people. You can go to Children's Health Defense, which is my organization, which and then there's other groups like Physicians for Informed Consent that publish information about every vaccine, for example. And you can see, why is my kid getting this? What does the science say? What do the major studies say? What are the side effects, et cetera? And what are the risks from the underlying disease to my child compared to the risks from taking this product? Those are all choices that individual parents have to make, and unfortunately, there's no easy way out. You got to do your own if you're a parent and you want to be a good parent, you need to do your own research about everything today, because everybody's lying to you. Everybody, like I said, the most profitable entity in America today is a sick child, and there's a lot of people who are going to profit from making your child sick. I forgot what your first question was.
So at the bottom line, the parent fights back. Let's say you're president today.
Okay.
What would you have done? How would you control these big?
Yeah, I've sued almost all the agencies. So I've sued CDC, I've sued FDA.
You sued them?
I've sued them. I've sued NIH, I've sued USDA, I've sued DOT, I've sued FCC. I just won a big suit against FCC. In the Court of Appeals for lying to the public about cell phone radiation, about cell phone safety. And see, FCC now has to go back and redo all of its regulations on your cell phones. Cell phone, if you got a kid, don't ever let him put his cell phone near his head, and don't let him carry it in one of his front pockets. If it's a girl, don't let them carry the cell phone in their breast pocket. Don't let them carry them anywhere near their ovaries. And the farther the cell phone is from your head, when you're talking, the better off you are. So, there's tens, literally, this is not hyperbole when I say tens of thousands of studies that show the really extreme dangers of cell phone radiation. And people are not paying attention. A lot of our kids sleep with the cell phone right next to their heads. They fall asleep with them on the bed. Don't let them do that. Get that cell phone. And if you can get away from them at night so that they get 8 hours without it anywhere near them, that is really important. Anyway, I've litigated against them all. And when you litigate against them, you get a PhD in how to unravel corporate capture. In many of these agencies, I know who the individuals are who are corrupt. And for example, when I sued Monsanto, we came across email exchanges between the heads of Monsanto, the top executives, and the head of the pesticide division at EPA, a man named Jess Rowland. I like saying his name because people should know who the villains are. And he was pretending to be a public official, but he was secretly working for Monsanto for a decade, fixing studies, hiring corrupt scientists, these mercenary scientists, we call them biostitutes, and to do phony studies, and then killing studies for Monsanto that would show the links between cancer and using Roundup. And and in many of the agencies, I can name the people who are actually the most corrupt. The major public health agency that needs to change, all of them do. FDA needs to be completely reorganized, and we have a whole plan for doing that. CDC has to be able to reorganize, and most of the stuff we can do without congressional help. We can do it through policy, through firing people, through guidance, and through regulations. But NIH is the most important because NIH was the gold standard scientific agency in the world. When I was a kid, most nations did not have a scientific research arm. The United States was really unique. There was a couple of European countries, like England does. We were putting hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars every year into scientific research. And there are many new nations, like in Africa and Asia, that in their constitutions, they would say, they would acknowledge we don't have a scientific agency, so whatever NIH says, that's what we're going to do. And the world was dependent on U.S. science. U.S. science was very good. It was gold standard. Then in 1980, we passed a rule in this country called the Bayh-Dole Act. It's a law that Congress passed. It said that individual scientists who work for NIH on new products, on new pharmaceutical products, can collect royalties on those products forever. And at NIH itself can collect royalties. So for example, the Moderna vaccine was developed initially by NIH, and NIH owns 50% of it. So NIH is making billions of dollars on that product, and yet it's getting us to use it, right? And it's making billions. So that's a conflict of interest. Plus, there are 6 individuals who work for NIH who were handpicked by Anthony Fauci, who each make $150,000 a year forever, not for their lives, but their children, their children's children. As long as that mRNA product is on the market, they're collecting money. And these are the highest officials at NIH. So the NIH has a budget, an annual budget of $42 billion. It distributes that money to 56,000 scientists, mainly at universities, to do scientific research. And it used to be they would be looking for what is causing the autism epidemic, what's causing the diabetes epidemic. Why did food allergies, peanut allergies, suddenly appear in 1989? Why did autoimmune diseases suddenly blow up in 1989? What happened? Those are the questions they would normally be asking. Those are the questions we want them to answer. They don't look at any of those issues. What they look at is how do we develop new drugs to treat all these chronic diseases and then cash in on them. And I'm going to end that. And I'm going to say, no, the maximum you can get is $1 per year. Right? And what has happened is that NIH, instead of doing scientific research now to find out what's making us sick, most of the studies they do are about incubating new drugs for the pharmaceutical industry and then cashing in on them. And so I'm going to end that, and I'm going to say, you know what, we're going to give infectious disease a break for a couple of years, and we're going to give drug development a break. And we're going to find out why America has the sickest children on the face of the earth.
Yes.
Right? And there is no nation in the world that has children as sick as ours. They are, when my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% of our children do. And as I said, when my uncle was president, there was 0 spent on chronic disease. Today, it's $4.3 trillion. It's 95% of our medical budget. And it's all on disease that for which there was no treatment because they were essentially non-existent prior to 1960. And we're now, there's no country in the world that has anything like this. We spend 2 to 3 times what Europeans spend on our health care, and we have the worst health outcomes. We're 79th in the world in health outcomes. We're behind Mongolia, behind Cuba, behind Nicaragua, behind Costa Rica. And we've lost 5 years since 1970 of longevity compared to European countries. You know, we're getting shorter and shorter lived every year. We have cancer rates, and it's not only our physical health, but mental health as well. Suicide's now the biggest, cause of death of teens, and you're seeing depression. I think 25% of women are on antidepressant drugs. I think 18% of our kids are on Adderall, and then SSRIs and benzos, and we're medicating the whole population, and we have the worst health outcomes. During COVID, America had the highest body count of any country in the world. So we had 16% of the COVID deaths in our country. We only have 4.2% of the world's population. There's countries, we were told Haiti is going to get wiped out by COVID because they're not going to be able to afford the vaccine. Nigeria is going to be wiped out. That's what Bill Gates and Fauci told us. Well, guess what? Haiti had a 1.3% vaccination rate. 1.3%. We had like an 87% here. Nigeria had a 1.4% vaccination rate, and Haiti had 14 deaths from COVID per million population. We had 300.
Oh, jeez.
Haiti had 13 deaths per million population. So we had 200 times the death rate. Black Americans were dying at 200 to 300 times the rate as blacks in Haiti, the poorest country in the hemisphere. And when CDC was asked about why do we have the highest death rates, they said it's not our fault, it's because Americans are so sick. They have all these chronic diseases. And the people who died from COVID were people who were obese, they had diabetes, they had asthma, they had autoimmune diseases, and that's what we have. So the average death from COVID, according to CDC, had 3.8 chronic diseases. So it was the chronic disease that was killing them. It was chronic disease that took them to the top of the cliff. And they're hanging there by their fingernails, and COVID came and stepped on their fingers and dropped them off. But it wasn't the COVID that was killing them. COVID did not kill healthy people. It killed unhealthy people. And we have the unhealthiest people in the world, and that's why we had the highest death rate. And why is our country, which had the best healthcare system in the world when I was a kid, why are we have the worst health of any country on earth? And 77% of our kids today are ineligible for military service because of poor health. This is a national security issue, but it's sinking us economically to 5 times our military budget. This is what's bankrupting our country more than anything else.
God bless you, Bobby Kennedy. Yeah. We just got a couple of minutes left. I just want to ask, obviously you made a huge decision. You met with Mr. Trump, former President Trump. And what do you think will be some of your moves in the first year, and what can the American public do to help?
Yeah, I mean, I had a series of conversations with President Trump. He reached out to me the night of his assassination attempt at Butler, and we talked probably 3 hours after that. I watched it on TV, and then 3 hours later, I was talking to him, and he talked about the idea of working together. And I flew out to Milwaukee the next day and had a meeting with him, and then we had a series of meetings after that by phone, and then a long, long meeting at Mar-a-Lago. And he outlined that the issues that got me into the race, Ukraine war, censorship, and chronic disease, that those were all issues that he was totally committed to. We talked in detail about those, and I said, we decided to form a unity ticket where I would join him. And on the issues that we agree on, we will work together, that we could still criticize each other on issues that we don't agree on. And that's been a very, very good arrangement for me, and it's been a very good relationship. So I'm very happy with it. I'm very confident that he's going to keep his word to me, and that I'm going to be able to work on those issues in the White House and make sure we solve them.